Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Now real quick, I just wanted to apologize about the 2-day hiatus I took between this video and the last. It's just, I made 7 videos last week. I was a bit burnt out, but I'm back and ready to go and really excited to talk about this. Okay, so before we get into it, now I don't know exactly what this video is going to be titled, but I have a rough idea, and you might be thinking that is the dumbest title I've ever read because almost all anime are about humans, so it's like, what are you talking about? I'm going to get into that. And let me just go back as to how I got here real quick, okay? So I just started watching No Game, No Life really recently, and by started watching, I mean I finished all 12 episodes like 3 days ago, and there was this really fascinating speech that I wanted to talk about, and at the same time, I started rewatching Baki because I plan on doing a video on that later on this week, and so I started rewatching that, and there was a speech that was talking about a very similar thing as the speech in No Game, No Life that I planned on talking about, and I thought these two intersected really well despite those two anime having nothing to do with one another. And so let's just get into it. Okay, so in episode 4 of No Game, No Life, all of the episodes that I talk about will be linked in the description below, so if you want to check that out after the video, go right ahead. Okay, so there was a speech when Sora first addresses the nation of Imanity, and as the king, and so he's talking about how Imanity once used to rule the continent, and that wasn't because they were the strongest or they were the fastest, but it was rather because that they were weak, because the only tool at their disposal was their intellect, because everyone else, because like let's say the war beast, right, they're much more physically, shall we say, gifted than humans are, but there was a reason that they ruled them, and I say ruled in like, in captions, do with that as you will, and that was because we realized that the one thing we have that they don't is our intellect. They don't have the intellect of our same level, so we had to sharpen that, so we had to get better and we had to get smarter than them, so that even though they had a physical advantage, we had such a large intellectual advantage that it still worked out in our favor. And that's where the Baki speech kicks in. I believe this speech was in episode 1 season 1 episode 5, yes. Okay, so this was talking about, there was a fight going on, and there was something really fascinating that was said, and that was that a man who pulls out a knife in the middle of a fist fight is losing the fight one way or another. And the guy says, well, that's stupid, because what's the point of playing fair if you lose? And he said, he's like, you need to adjust your attitude. And the reason is that when you give yourself an advantage, you lose the advantage of having a disadvantage. The line was something along those lines, and it was such a fascinating line, because at first it seems like the most dumb thing anyone's ever said, because it's like, well, how can the ability of having a disadvantage be an advantage? But there is some truth to this, because he says that what wins a fight is a man's guts and pride, and couldn't agree more. Much more than even more than your training, or even more than how much physically strong your opponent is than you. A big thing in winning a fight is the ability to keep going. If, let's say, your opponent is much stronger than you, but you just keep getting up regardless of how much he knocks you down, guess what? Eventually there's gonna come a time when he tires out, and if he doesn't have the same guts as you, guess what? He'll lose. That's just how it works. And so it was so fascinating how these two sort of correlated between one another, because they were both talking about how being at a disadvantage is sort of an advantage. Now they both lead into in sort of different ways, because one's talking about a physical fight, in Baki, where you're fighting an opponent and you don't want to have an advantage, because when you're at a disadvantage, your body goes into overdrive, your mind goes into overdrive, your pride kicks in, and you go, I am not losing this, I don't care what happens. And in No Game, No Life, they're talking about more, strategical advantages, and how because humans were weak compared to the other one, compared to the other races, and they realized that they can't use magic, or that they don't have the physical attributes that, again, war beasts do, for example. The only thing they could do was to sharpen their intellect, and so these two go at it a slightly different way, but the real thing that they're talking about is actually very correlated, and it's that having a disadvantage is actually a phenomenal thing, because it'll force you to because it'll force you to level up the one attribute that you have in spades that the other opponent just doesn't, because that's just how it works, right? There's no way someone is better than you at everything. It just, unless you're facing someone so far out of your caliber, it just doesn't happen. Hell, in what, I think it was episode 1 of No Game No Life, maybe it was episode 2, Blank beat Tet, the god of games, and that was because, guess what, they were at a disadvantage when Shiro started playing, so Sora went, alright, we'll play together, because together we can't lose. And so the point is, when you're at a disadvantage, you have the ability to think better, you have the ability to see clearer what you wouldn't be able to when you're at an advantage, because your pride sort of kicks in, but sort of in a different way. I don't know how to explain it as well as I could. And that's because your pride kicks in and you go, oh, there's no need for me to try as hard as I can. This is already a one fight. But when you're losing a fight because you have a disadvantage, your guts kick in and you go, I am not losing this. I'm going to give it everything I have. And even if I lose, even after giving it everything I had, at least I'll know that what I need to get better at. I'll learn things. That's just because losing and defeat is seen as this really, really bad thing, but it's really not. And the reason is, when you lose, you expose your own flaws. You realize and you see the areas where it's necessary for you to grow. And that's why I just thought it was so fascinating that these two anime who have nothing to do with one another. One is largely let's say a strategic game, for lack of a better word, for No Game No Life, and Baki is much more about martial arts, and it's much more about a physical contest of power, right? And so they still talked about the same thing, because the human psychology remains the same regardless of what genre you're playing, regardless of what game you're playing. And that's it. And that's, if you have a disadvantage, you have the weird advantage of having the disadvantage. It's phrased so good that I've thought about this for a long time, like for 3 or 4 days now, and I honestly can't think of a better way to phrase it than they did in Baki. It's utterly phenomenal. When you have a disadvantage, you have the advantage of having a disadvantage. And that's just what you have to remember. Regardless of how much you think that, it's unwinnable, regardless of how bad the situation is looking, you gotta realize it's never unwinnable. This was also stated in, I believe, Kuroko no Basuke, and that was the only time you actually lose is when you give up. And so, if you guys made it this far into the video, please, subscribe. It really does help a small channel like me out. Click notifications, all the stuff. I just wanted to thank you guys for coming all the way out here, and I think I'm about 8 minutes in, or maybe 6, I really can't look. And so I just wanted to thank you guys once again, and you have yourself a great day, and I think I'll see you all tomorrow. Catch ya.